Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this big, beautiful planet of ours, and welcome to the kickoff, the official kickoff of the Wholistic Center. My name is Nicolas Zart, and if you look me up on the internet, you'll notice that I'm usually associated with very different things than those that are more philosophical and even spiritual. I do work in the transportation mobility sector, most specifically in what we call innovative mobility solutions. I have a successful podcast called The Ways We Move, but I wanted to do something a little different. And this is an old idea that's been around, at least kicking around in my mind for the last 20 years, a sort of a holistic platform, a holistic center. But I didn't want to make it holistic we normally spell with an H. I wanted to make it whole, spell it with a W, hence the name of the website, theholisticcenter.com, spelled with a W. Before I explain a little bit more about all of this, I should also explain who I am and why I did that. And I think it will probably appeal to many of you who feel like you sometimes have a hard time fitting in this very crazy society of ours. Well, I'm just like you in this aspect, still at the ripe age of 60, still trying to find my way through life. And I assume I will continue to do that for a long time. One of the things about me, which many of you will definitely relate with, is I always felt a little different. I always felt that the things that I was being taught at school and in my Western society just didn't really make a heck of a lot of sense to me. I always go back to this one story that I remember. I was about 7 or 8 years old or years young. And I wanted to have, a good conversation with my dad because I was pretty much born with ancient memories, things that didn't make any sense in this life. But I remember having lived in different places. I remember being very drawn to ancient Asia, to the very early prehistoric days of China, Japan, all these places. And so I wanted to have a philosophical conversation with my father at the age of 7 or 8 because I wanted to learn, I wanted to grow. I was out here to experience things. And so we were in our backyard, and my father was a very staunch German guy from Hamburg, had gone through the very last few years of World War II and was working very hard at IBM to provide us with a wonderful life. Now, of course, when you're 7 years old, you don't understand all of that. But I wanted to engage this figure in my life, this rock solid figure in my life on the philosophical aspect of life. So I picked a topic I thought was very natural, and that was, Dad, do rocks live? Now, that question wasn't meant so much because I wanted him to say yes or no. I knew they lived. At least they had a different type of awareness and a different type of life than we have, but it was obvious that they did. I was very disappointed by his answer because his answer was very pragmatic, and perhaps at the time he was focusing on something else, didn't have the time to answer, but he just said no. And I was so disappointed. So I continued. I said, well, all right, let's tone it down. Let's use another question that will sort of ease him into this deep philosophical conversation I was craving. So I said, well, tell me, how many parts is there to a human skull? And of course, at that point, I already understood about atoms. I understood about all of that, electrons, protons, neutrons, and even down to the the quarks and the quarks and the different things that made up all of that. Yes, even at the age of 7. So I was really expecting a conversation around the world of atoms, and all of that. And he said, no, there are only 4 parts, but it really just becomes one big part after. And that was it. Then I remember at that point, at the ripe age of 7 or 8, thinking, interesting, these adults. I don't want to be an adult like that, that's for sure. And perhaps this has maybe slowed down my maturity. My poor wife, she's been through so much with me. But at the age of 60, I've lived my life in a very different way than most other people do. And I know there are a lot of people like me out there. But I knew what felt right. I knew what didn't feel right. And in fact, I felt so out of place in this Western society that in high school, when I finally read, I was taking a class called Eastern Philosophies. And I read the Tao Te Ching or the Tao Te Ching, depending on how you pronounce it. And this Taoistic way of viewing life made perfect sense to me. I was home. I understood it. I was like, wow, that finally makes sense. And if you don't know much about Taoism really states that you can't explain what life is, what the source of life is, but you can say what it isn't. So I love that wonderful paradigm of Asian thinking, and that helped me understand a lot of things. Now, of course, if you should read the Tao Te Ching or Chuang Tzu's incredible treatise on Taoism that teaches you a lot about trying to explain that ineffable way of life through a human mind that is very finite and very dualistic by nature, or at least by the way it's being brought up. Anyway, so after that, I was really lucky. I got to read Gary Zukav's The Wu Wei Dancing Masters, and that introduced me to the world of quantum physics, which I still hate saying it's physics to this day, because once you understand anything about quantum sciences, it's anything but physics. It really is about what happens beyond the observer changes the results of what they are observing, the double slit experiment and everything. All of these things are very, very eye-opening. And to me, at the age of 17, reading this, I thought, wow, finally, there it is. That one thing that I've been waiting for all my life, the bridge between science, Newtonian science, and spirituality, philosophies, whatever you want to call it. If I thought, now that people understand what quantum sciences is, won't call it quantum physics, then all of a sudden, philosophies, religions, all of that start to make sense. So that started me on a very long road that eventually ended up to the Wholistic Center. But about 20 years ago, as I was doing more and more research, and remember, this started way before the internet. This started in the 80s when we only had books. I started discovering things like Dzogchen, like Tibetan Buddhism, which I had also been taught at school. And the more I was doing research on that, the early Sufi days era, eventually I became familiar with Hermetic philosophies, and the more and more I'm learning about this, the early Copt communities, the Gnostic communities, the more and more I'm reading about this, and more I'm thinking, wow, there's really a unifying thread here. And I, very naively, I wanted to find a place where you can learn about these things. And I turned my attention to, this is really the fundamental shape of what I wanted the Wholistic Center to be, is whatever happened to the Alexandrian big library. It was set on fire. Plenty of ideas why it was, but whatever happened to these places where you would come and learn about these things, the Greek schools of thoughts, the Tibetan schools of thoughts, and of course, down in South America. So I kind of wanted this to be the same thing in an online kind of way. So what you will find over here is nothing new. I'm not reinventing the wheel. In fact, I'm going to talk a lot about what other people do, but you're going to hear a lot about being a holistic person. And again, holistic with a W. What does it mean? And it means not embracing everything, but not rejecting everything, right? So I always had a hard time considering myself a Buddhist because, I'm also a Taoist. I'm also a Hermeticist. I'm also a Gnostic, so on and so forth, right? So what does it mean to be a holistic person? Well, it means understanding all these different schools of thoughts, religions, philosophies. And two things can happen at that point. Either you take parts of it and bring it into your life for your own philosophy, your own way of being, or they wake up something inside of you, something that you've always known, something that maybe you carried from past lives and everything. The one thing I wanted to do different with the Wholistic Center that many of my other spiritual friends do, or my business friends do, is I wanted to find a unifying platform, again, such as what, Hermeticists have done with East and West. And that would be to unite the business aspects of our lives with the spiritual aspects of our lives. And that's a very difficult subject to talk about. I do have some trepidations about coming out and saying, hey, Nicolas is also, a spiritual person, because strangely enough, in our industry, in the mobility world, the transportation world, and even lots of other industries, there are a lot of spiritual people. I've had wonderful conversations with my business friends about spirituality, philosophy, and things like that, even religion. So it's there, but we don't really talk about it as much. And it needs to be talked because a lot of these people designing airplanes, cars, air taxis, and things like that, they have a very strong philosophical background. In fact, some of them really understand the importance of the Vedas that talk about original saucer designs. And remember, these are 10,000-year-old documents, right? Kind of a head scratcher. So in the Holistic Center, I really want to try to put together the different ways of how does spirituality fit into our world. Well, there you go. Episode 1 of the Holistic Center podcast is underway. We've launched the website. We've launched the concept. I don't know where it's going. I don't know in what, well, I kind of have an idea what direction it's going, but it is the very first episode and one of many to come. I have enough articles to write for a whole year, and I also have a bunch of people I will interview on this podcast where you will hear from practitioners out there. We hope you've enjoyed this. The reason why the Holistic Center exists is because I feel truly deep down inside that we do need a more holistic approach, not only to life, but to the universe, which is by definition holistic, and also ourselves. When we look around, especially with politics these days, or should we say basement level politics, they're divisive. They polarize people one against the other, and that never really works out well in the end. And ultimately, it disempowers us. And the Holistic Center is more around the idea of empowering us to go back inside, like the Taoists have taught us to do, like the Hermeticists have taught us to do, like the Gnostics have taught us to do, to go look for that inner wisdom, that inner guidance, that inner compass. And by the way, speaking of that, there are a few more articles on theholisticcenter.com that you can read about that. We'll talk about it a little bit more. If you've liked this, please give us a thumbs up, please subscribe, and also share with other people who might be interested in this. We will give you as much free content as we can do, and at some point or another, obviously, we will be looking for sponsors, because all of this takes not only a lot of time, but it takes a lot of computers and microphones and stuff like that we also need help with. So we hope you've enjoyed this. This is really to explain why the Holistic Center is what it is. Also remember, there are no gurus, no teachers here. We're just working together. We're seekers, and we want to find out, what do ancient civilizations and societies have to teach us philosophically today for practical use, and that means also at work. My name is Nicolas Zart. I am your host on the Holistic Center podcast, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll bump things up maybe to twice a week pretty soon. Thank you all. See you next week.